A soft metallic exhale drifted through the air, and the moment it faded, the night closed around them like a mouth swallowing light. Denise sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands twisting the edge of her skirt the way a frightened child might cling to a blanket. 23, fresh out of college, and already feeling like she'd stepped into adulthood with no map and no destination. 2 substitute shifts, a week wasn't a future, and every phone call from her mother reminded her of that. When Brett turned off the engine, the last notes of the radio collapsed into silence. The stillness that followed felt unnatural, as if the world itself had pressed pause. Denise felt it in her lungs, that strange pressure, like even breathing might disturb something lurking in the dark. Brett motioned her closer and she slid across the cold vinyl. His arm wrapped around her and the familiar smell of his cologne filled her nose, sharp, heavy, the scent that clung to everything he owned. They'd been together almost a year. He worked nights at the stamping plant, had his own place, a decent car, a plan. He talked about rings. Her mother approved. That alone made things feel inevitable. He kissed her gently at first, then deeper. The taste of the cheap beer they shared earlier lingered on his tongue. His hand moved and she didn't stop it. This was Mercy Hill after all, the place people came when the world felt too small and the future too uncertain. But then Brett froze. His breath hitched, a short, uneven pull of air. Denise blinked, her lips still parted, following his gaze toward the trees. The forest looked different now, not peaceful but watchful. A wall of black trunks pressed in around them, their branches swallowing what little moonlight existed. She listened hard. Nothing. No insects. No birds. Not even the whisper of wind through the pines. Just the soft clicking of the engine cooling and the frantic thud of her heartbeat. Something was wrong. Brett's hand slipped toward his jacket, a quick, nervous motion. Denise opened her mouth to ask what he heard. That's when it came. A slow, scraping drag of metal against metal. Right beside her door. Not an accident. Not a branch. Something or someone was drawing their fingernails, or a blade, or God knows what else, across the handle she had just touched. Deliberate. Measuring. Testing the lock. The sound clawed its way up the metal, a rising, razor-sharp shriek that stabbed straight through her jaw and made her bones hum. Denise tried to scream, but terror strangled her voice. What escaped her throat was fragile, broken, barely a sound at all. The scraping dragged higher, skimmed across the window frame, and then everything fell dead silent again. Brett's fingers dug into her arm with a pressure that promised bruises. In the dimness, she could see the shape of his face, drained of color, lips pressed tight, eyes fixed on the empty night outside. The cologne that usually clung to him had been swallowed by the sharp scent of fear. He fumbled for his door, panic turning his hands clumsy. The moment it swung open, the dome light snapped on, flooding the car in a harsh glow. For a single heartbeat, Denise saw him clearly, wide-eyed, trembling, looking more like prey than the man she thought she knew. Then he vanished into the night, slamming the door hard enough to make the glass shiver. The light blinked out. Darkness folded around her once more. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Something stirred in the woods. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, heavy ones. Branches cracking under weight too deliberate to be wildlife. Leaves whispering as something pushed through them, getting closer with each breath she took. 10, 11, 12. Where was Brett? He should have been at her window by now. Should have been rattling the handle, whispering that everything was just her imagination. That it was a squirrel, a tree limb, anything but this. 2021. The driver's door exploded open, slamming against its hinges. Brett hurled himself back into the seat, choking on air, his entire body convulsing with panic. He jammed the key into the ignition so hard it nearly snapped. The engine coughed. Once, twice. A sickening pause. Then it roared awake. Brett threw the car into reverse, tires screaming as they skidded across dirt. Denise lurched forward, catching herself on the dashboard as the Chevy fishtailed back onto the path. He slammed it into drive, and the car shot forward, clawing its way through the narrow trail. Branches slapped the sides of the car like hands reaching in. The headlights sliced through the forest, trees flashing by in rigid rows, like bars on a cage they were desperately trying to escape. They burst onto the main road, tires whining as Brett jerked the wheel right. The speedometer climbed viciously, 50, 60, 70, the old frame rattling as if it might come apart at the bolts. Brett stabbed at the radio with a trembling hand, missing twice. Denise reached over, flipping it on. Static crackled, then a calm male voice slid into the cabin, too steady, too normal for the nightmare they were in. Escaped from the Ypsilanti State Forensics Center approximately 6 hours ago. The patient, whose identity is being withheld, is considered extremely dangerous. Authorities believe he may be traveling north toward the Ludington area. Denise felt the blood drain from her face. The suspect is male, around 6 feet tall, and is missing his left hand after a farming accident in 1979. He is known to wear a prosthetic. A hook. A steel hook. Brett slapped the radio off with a force that made Denise jump. The car hurtled down Highway 10, the darkness swallowing everything behind them. Ludington's glow flickered ahead of them, a promise of safety that somehow felt too far away. Brett kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his hands clamped so tightly on the wheel that his knuckles looked bloodless. He was there, Brett whispered, voice warping under the weight of fear. At Mercy Hill, I knew it. I heard the bulletin at Denny's before you came back from the bathroom. I didn't tell you. I thought he'd be halfway across the state by now. He swallowed hard enough that she heard it. But when we were leaving, I swear, Denise, I heard him breathing behind the car. Denise felt the world tilt. The closer they got to town, the more she realized how small she felt inside her own skin. Her apartment, a cramped basement unit with damp walls and a single narrow window, suddenly seemed like the only place she wanted to be. A place she could lock herself inside and pretend the world wasn't coming apart. Brett didn't slow. He tore through a red light on Dallin Street, and she didn't even flinch. When he finally pulled up in front of her building, he shut off the engine but didn't move. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. He stared forward as if expecting the dark to peel open and reveal something monstrous. Then he turned to her. There was something in his eyes, something shaken and raw that she couldn't decode. She stepped out, the night air cooling the sweat on her face. The walk to her basement door stretched out like a tunnel. She needed a hot shower. She needed every lock she owned. She needed to hear her mother's voice, even if it came with scolding. Behind her, the car door slammed. She spun. Brett stood beside the passenger side, framed by the orange streetlight. He didn't speak. He just lifted one hand, motioning her closer with a small, urgent gesture. Her feet felt like they were wadding through mud as she approached. Then he stepped aside, and Denise's breath shattered. Embedded in the passenger door handle, sunk so deep it had warped the metal, was a hook. Not a costume piece, not a prop, Surgical steel, polished except for the smear of dry darkness at its tip. Blood. Real blood. The curve of it gleamed like a question mark carved from moonlight. For a long, terrible moment, she couldn't look away. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the curb. The world narrowed to the sound of her own ragged breathing as she bent forward, pressing her forehead to her knees, fighting the sensation that she might tumble straight out of her own body. Brett sat beside her, silent at first, then gently draping an arm around her shoulders. This time, it felt different, steadier, heavier, grounded in something fierce and frightening. He whispered to her, soft words she couldn't quite understand, but they wrapped around her like a blanket. Promises, maybe, reassurances. She clung to them anyway. Because in that moment she wanted to believe him, needed to. The weeks that followed felt unreal, like she was walking inside a dream made of cracked glass. Denise lived in constant readiness, checking locks 3 times before bed, avoiding every shadow after sundown, keeping the pepper spray in her purse always within reach. Her fingers brushed it so often it felt like a prayer bead she didn't remember choosing. And Brett became everything. Calling every morning to ask if she'd slept, checking on her every night to make sure she was safe. He drove her everywhere, school, home, errands she barely had the strength to run. On the days she couldn't stop crying, when the fear came out of her in sudden, flooding waves, he simply held her and let the tears fall. He didn't use words. He didn't need to. His quiet presence steadied her in a way nothing else did. Her mother stopped lecturing her about wasted youth. The hook man dominated the news for 3 days, then disappeared from the headlines the same way he'd slipped through the woods, leaving no footprints, no trail, no proof. The police found nothing between the forensic center and Ludington. No sightings, no evidence, nothing except the hook itself. Brett took it to the station the next morning. Denise stayed in the car, watching him through the glass doors. He showed pictures on his phone, pointed to the damage on the passenger door. The desk sergeant jotted something down, nodded in that absent-minded way cops did when the world was on fire and they'd grown numb to heat. But nothing happened. 2 weeks later, when Brett called for an update, they told him there was no record, no report, no notes, no trace he'd ever walked in. Paperwork gets lost, Brett told her gently. They're getting calls from every scared person in the county. Monsters behind sheds, shadows in cornfields. They've got real cases, real victims. His voice was soft, understanding, and she believed him. Summer arrived like a heavy blanket. Substitute assignments dried up, and she spent her days folded inside her dim basement apartment, blinds shut, doors locked, air conditioner humming like her own personal guardian. Brett visited whenever he could, before work, after work, sometimes during lunch with sandwiches or cheap takeout. He'd nap on her couch, and she'd sit beside him, studying the easy rhythm of his breathing and thinking how safe the room felt when he was there. He proposed in July. There was no grand gesture, no candlelight, no kneeling. They were eating pizza on her couch, watching some late-night action movie. During a commercial break, he reached into his pocket and held out a small white gold ring, the diamond barely catching the lamp light. There was a question in his eyes, soft and hopeful. And she said yes. Because what else could she say? He'd protected her, helped her stand when she could barely get through a day without trembling. He loved her. That had to be enough. Her mother was ecstatic. Brett's parents, a quiet, polite couple from Manistee, seemed more reserved but kind. They met for dinner at a little Italian place downtown, planning a simple ceremony, just family, a reception at the Elks Lodge afterward. Then August rolled in heavy and wet, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made every hour feel like a slow, exhausting dream. August pressed down on the town like a heavy hand, the kind of heat that made every breath feel borrowed. Inside her basement apartment, though, Denise lived in a different season. Cool air drifted along the floor, settling around her ankles as she spent long afternoons curled up with library romances, or numbing her mind with whatever daytime shows flickered across the old TV. She tried to keep her thoughts light, tried not to revisit that night on Mercy Hill. But the mind doesn't obey. Late at night, when Brett was working and the apartment was steeped in artificial cold, she would lie awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the soft ticking of her wall clock. That was when her thoughts betrayed her, dragging her back to the metallic scream against the car door, Brett's voice shaking, the radio warning about a man with a steel hand, and the hook wedged into her door handle. Each memory felt sharp, wrong somehow, like a story she kept retelling to herself that never settled properly in her chest. Weeks passed before she realized why. It happened on a thick mid-August night, the air outside swollen with the promise of a storm. Denise was drifting on the edge of sleep when a single detail snapped into place like a trap closing. The radio. Brett claimed he'd heard the news bulletin while she was in the restroom at the diner, but she had been gone only minutes. When she returned, he hadn't looked shaken. He'd been calm, chewing, sipping, joking lightly. Not a hint of panic in his face. Not the look of a man who just learned a killer was on the loose. She sat up sharply, the air conditioner whirred to life, rattling against the wall. Unless he'd heard it later, in the car, but she would have heard it too. She remembered every second of that night with painful clarity, and that bulletin had come out of nowhere, perfectly timed, almost too perfectly. A cold ripple moved through her. She slid out of bed, crossed the room, and pulled a worn phone book from the bottom drawer of her desk. Her fingers traced the thin pages until she found what she needed. With trembling hands, she dialed the number for the local police. A deputy answered. His voice was steady, almost bored. She asked about an escape, a dangerous patient, months ago, back in May. He hesitated, then told her he couldn't share details about open investigations. "It's not open," she insisted. "Please, I just need to know if it happened." There was a pause, typing in the background. Then the deputy said something that made her feel like the ground had tilted sideways. "There's no record of any escape from that facility this year." The line went dead. Denise didn't even remember hanging up. She just stood there in the dark, clutching the cold plastic receiver, her pulse thudding in her ears. No escape. No fugitive. No hookman. Every breath felt thin. The truth struck her with the force of a fist, so simple, so awful. Brett had made it all up. Her knees gave out and she collapsed into her chair, gripping the arms to steady herself. Why? Why would he do something so monstrous? The answer arrived with horrifying clarity. To frighten her, to cut her off from the world, to make himself the only safe place she had left. Every ride, every meal, every comforting embrace, they weren't kindnesses. They were chains. She thought about that night again, the metallic scrape, Brett slipping out of the car, his frantic return. Her stomach twisted. She lunged for her purse, spilling its contents across the floor until she found her keys. Hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice, she rushed out into the hallway. Her storage closet, small, cramped, barely big enough for old boxes, waited behind a locked door. And some part of her already knew what she would find when she opened it. She slipped into the storage room behind her building, the one place she never expected to find anything dangerous. Brett kept a few things there: heavy coats, old tools, boxes he hadn't touched in years. One of them sat buried in the back, sealed tight with yellowing tape. Something in her chest tightened as she tore it open. Inside were textbooks, criminal justice, the mind's darker patterns, the science of crime scenes. She knew he'd taken a few classes once, but seeing them stacked together felt like stumbling onto a part of him she was never meant to see. Then her fingers brushed a binder. It was thick, worn at the edges, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Scraps of newsprint filled every sleeve, stories from small towns scattered across the Midwest, each one a retelling of the same horrifying tale. Lovers parked alone, a stranger lurking in the dark, a metal hook scraping against a car door. Different places, different years, but the same script over and over. And none of the stories were real. The final page wasn't a clipping at all. It was a list, handwritten, his handwriting. She stared at the crooked letters she'd once thought were endearing on birthday cards. Equipment needed. Costume piece. Recording setup. A mock news segment. Rehearsal required. Timing matters. Below it, a second list. Stage 1, fear. Stage 2, dependence. Stage 3, isolation. Stage 4. That question mark hit her harder than any word on the page. A silent warning. A hint of an ending she was never supposed to reach. A cold clarity washed over her, wiping out every tremor in her hands. She finally understood what stage 4 would be, what it had always been for women who were frightened, cut off, reshaped into something fragile by the very person who claimed to love them. They didn't vanish all at once. They slipped away gradually, swallowed by a story no one questioned. She'd been emotional. She'd been struggling. And he had been the devoted boyfriend everyone admired. The walls of the tiny closet seemed to press in on her as she shoved the binder back into the box and locked the door behind her. Back inside her apartment, she checked the window overlooking the dim side yard. Locked. Always locked. Locked so many times she memorized the sound. But locks didn't matter. He still had a key. He'd asked for it months ago, just to feed her cat, he'd said. He'd smiled when he said she'd given it to him. And she never asked for it back. The microwave glowed too, 17 a.m. His shift ended at 6. He would come by afterward, like he always did. Warm breakfast in hand. A soft kiss on her forehead. His usual question whispered into her hair. How did you sleep? She checked the clock. 3 hours and 43 minutes. That was all the time she had before he'd show up again, unless he decided to come early. At 2:31 a.m., her phone began to ring. The sound sliced through the darkness like a blade. She stared at the glowing caller ID on her old landline, heart thudding in her throat. When she finally lifted the receiver, she didn't say a single word. His voice filled the line gentle, worried. He said he'd noticed her bedroom light from the road. Asked if she was all right. Offered to leave work in the middle of the night, just to be with her. She forced out a lie. She told him she was fine. Just restless. No, don't come over. Morning would be soon enough. When he whispered those 3 words, she repeated them back, each one scraping her lungs raw, then hung up. She moved to the window. Across the street, his truck was sitting in the dark, engine humming softly, headlights off. He wasn't at work. He never left. He had been watching her. 10 long minutes crawled past before the truck finally flicked on its lights and rolled away into the night. She didn't exhale until the red glow of his taillights vanished. She shut her bedroom door and turned the lock, knowing full well it would barely slow him down. Still, she did it. Then she climbed into bed with a can of pepper spray clutched like a lifeline. Sleep never came. When the first thin stretch of daylight crept through her small window, she got up. Her movements were mechanical. Shower, jeans, a sweater, shoes she could run in. She packed a small bag with the essentials, a change of clothes, her birth certificate, and the $700 she had tucked away for the wedding she now knew she'd never walk into. At 7:30, she called her mother. Her explanation was thin. She needed to stay for a few days. The silence on the other end said everything. Concern, confusion, hesitation. Denise didn't wait for the flood of questions. She ended the call. Bag in one hand, pepper spray in the other, she stepped outside without looking back at the place she had thought was safe. Her car was waiting in the lot behind the building. She got in, started the engine, pulled onto Lakeshore Drive. 2 blocks down, his truck appeared like a shadow. He kept his distance, just far enough not to pull attention 3, maybe 4 car lengths behind, but close enough she could feel him in her rearview mirror. Every turn she made, he made. Every rise in her speed, he matched. When she merged onto the highway heading north, he did too. Her palms were slick against the steering wheel. The pepper spray sat on the seat beside her like a useless prey. The thought came to her, pull over, confront him, demand the truth. But she already knew what the truth was. And she knew exactly what followed truth. Stage 4. So she kept driving. Mile after mile vanished beneath her tires, past small towns, past empty stretches of forest, past every place she had once felt safe. He followed through all of it, a silent shadow cutting through the gray morning light. When she finally turned into her parents' driveway, her breath caught in her chest. His truck didn't slow, didn't pause, didn't even glance her way. He simply kept going. Her mother opened the door before she reached him, worry etched deep into her face. Denise couldn't answer a single one of her questions. Her throat refused to form the truth. Her mother stepped aside quietly, letting her in. She spent the rest of the day on the old twin bed she'd grown up in. The same bed where she'd once dreamed of the world feeling big and open and full of possibilities. Now it felt like the only place left where she could breathe. She spent the next day drifting in and out of old memories, lying on the same narrow bed where she had studied for exams, cried over breakups, and stared at the ceiling dreaming about adulthood. Her mother brought meals without probing. Her father tried once to check on her, knocked quietly, then retreated when she didn't respond. At 8 that evening, the phone rang. She heard her mother answer, her gentle voice smoothing out the edges of concern, assuring Brett that Denise just needed time to breathe, and that she'd pass along whatever he wanted her to hear. Afterward, the house settled back into its usual rhythms, the murmur of the TV in the living room, her father's favorite game show playing as though nothing in the world had changed. 2 hours later, the phone rang again. This time, Denise picked up the handset in her childhood bedroom. Brett asked if she was all right, if she was upset about wedding decisions, if he had done something wrong. She fed him a soft excuse that she was overwhelmed, sorting out her thoughts. His reaction wasn't simple relief. It was something heavier, too eager, as though he had expected a far darker explanation. When he ended the call with "I love you," she matched the words out of habit, not truth. That night, once her parents were asleep, she turned on the old desktop computer in her father's study. The machine came to life in a slow, groaning struggle, the fan rattling like it was fighting to stay alive. She waited for the home screen to load, a knot tightening in her chest. She typed Brett's name first. His social media page was exactly what she expected: sports jokes, fishing photos, snapshots of his truck, their engagement announcement. His friend list barely filled a page. Coworkers, a few relatives, and one woman she didn't recognize. Jessica Vinn, 31, blonde, pale-eyed. Living up north now, but once from the same town. Denise opened her profile. At first glance, it looked empty, just a scattering of pictures and almost no personal details. Nearly blank, but one photograph made her freeze. Jessica stood in front of a white house with black shutters. She was smiling, but only with her mouth. Her eyes looked hollow, watchful. Denise knew that house. Brett had lived there years ago. Her pulse thudded. She sent a friend request before she could overthink it. 3 days later, Jessica accepted. Denise typed a message, trying to keep her hands steady. "Hey, I know this is random. I'm with Brett now, and since you two are friends on here, I thought I'd say hi. Hope that's okay." The response arrived 2 hours later. "Not weird. How long have you been with him?" 8 months. We're engaged." A pause. "Congratulations. When's the wedding?" "November." The typing bubble appeared, faded, returned. "Finally. Can I call you?" Denise sent her number before fear could talk her out of it. 5 minutes later, her phone rang. Jessica's voice was soft, almost gentle, but behind it was something brittle. She didn't open with small talk. "Leave him," she said quietly. "Please don't wait." Denise felt the room tilt. Her mouth went dry. "Why?" she whispered. Jessica inhaled sharply, like pulling air around a wound, and then she began to speak in short, tense fragments. No build-up, no hesitation, just the raw shape of a memory she clearly hated reliving. 3 years ago, 6 months into dating him, a road outside Manistee. He took me there, said it was peaceful. Then the scratching on the car, panic, a knife in his hand. Her voice trembled, and every word tightened around Denise's heart like a vice. The memory gnawed at her, Jessica describing the scratching on the car door when they returned home. The story of an escaped prisoner Brett had used to terrify her, but Jessica had checked. No reports, no alerts, nothing. It had been a lie. Jessica had moved in with him after that, and that's when the real nightmare began. He'd been careful at first, protective, almost kind, but controlling. Panic attacks became a daily shadow. Sleep was impossible. He'd convinced her to quit her waitressing job, saying the stress was too much. Then little by little, she had nothing left. No friends, no money, no independence, just him. Her sister had come to visit once. Brett had been relentless, combing through Jessica's phone, questioning every movement, watching her like she was a caged animal. One night, he had grabbed her arm, bruising it in a grip that left her gasping. That was the moment she realized this wasn't love. This was possession. Her sister had rescued her the next morning while he was at work. They drove north, away from the town that had felt safe but was anything but. "What do you think would have happened if you'd stayed?" Denise asked quietly during the call. Silence. Then Jessica's voice tight and low. There were others before me. The way Brett spoke of his exes, how they had vanished from the world, made Denise's stomach twist. No social media, no friends, no trace, like they'd simply been erased. By the end of the call, Jessica gave her 3 names: Andrea Wilson, Courtney Mayers, and someone she only knew as Kelsey. All women Brett had been involved with, all gone. Denise sat in the dark living room after the call, listening to the slow, steady breaths of her parents down the hall, and felt the chill of stage 4 crawling over her. She began digging. Andrea Wilson's profile barely existed, last post in 2013. Before that, mundane updates about library shifts, gardening, her cat. Then nothing. Courtney Mayers followed the same pattern, active until 2015, then erased. Kelsey Prather, engaged to Brett back in 2011. Her last post, a photo of a modest white gold engagement ring with the caption, "He asked and I said yes." After that, silence. Denise scoured news articles, missing person reports, anything. Nothing. 3 women, each tied to Brett, each vanished digitally, leaving no trace of their existence. She thought about the police, but what could she say? My fiancé's exes, they disappeared from the internet. They would laugh her off just like they had Jessica. By the time dawn slipped through the curtains, she finally sank into the couch and drifted into a restless, haunted sleep. Dreams of hooks scraping metal, women screaming, shadows stretching through darkened rooms chased her into the fragile light of morning. When Brett arrived at noon, Denise hadn't moved yet. Her mother let him in before she could intervene. In his hand, he carried daisies, her favorite. He gave her that uneasy half-smile as they sat on the porch, the evening air heavy and still around them. Inside, her parents had vanished into the kitchen, leaving the 2 of them in quiet tension. He started to apologize, voice low and measured, claiming he'd been too protective after Mercy Hill, that maybe he'd gone too far. There was a sincerity in his tone, or at least it sounded like it. If Denise hadn't known what she knew, she might have believed him. When she told him she needed a few more days to think, something flickered in his eyes, fast, sharp, gone almost before she could register it. He masked it with a gentle smile, pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, and drove off. She watched the tail lights fade around the corner, then turned inside and told her mother she needed to make some calls. It took 3 days to track them down. Andrea Wilson was living in Traverse City under a married name, Andrea Cudsey. Denise had dug through wedding announcements, poring over old archives from 2016, and finally found a lead. Andrea answered on the 4th ring, voice tight with confusion when Denise mentioned Brett Holloway. Carefully, Denise explained. The hookman, the fake radio bulletin, the pattern. Andrea went silent for a long moment. Then her voice trembled as she spoke, small fragments of her own nightmare spilling out. Something happened with us too, Fisherman's Island State Park, scratching on the car. He panicked. Said something about an escaped prisoner. The scratches were deep, like from a tool. I was terrified for months. Her voice dropped lower. I moved in with him because I felt safer, but one day I went through his stuff, found a box, research notes, urban legends about attacks at Lover's Lane. That's when I knew. She had packed her things while he was at work and fled to her sister's house, never going back. Brett had tried to reach her for a while, calls, texts, even showing up, but eventually he gave up. Denise pressed on. Do you know what happened to the women he dated after you? Silence hung like a weight. Then Andrea spoke cautiously. There was this girl, Courtney, we were friends on Facebook. She started dating Brett right after we broke up. I tried to warn her, sent a message, told her to be careful, but she never replied. Then her profile just disappeared. 2 days later, Denise found Courtney in the unlikeliest of places. The obituary section of the Ludington Daily News, archived on microfilm at the public library. Denise's hands trembled as she traced the typed letters. Courtney Lynn Mayers, 25, of Lincoln, died unexpectedly on November 3, 2015. Services private. Arrangements by Estes Ledley Funeral Home. No cause, no details, just unexpectedly. Her pulse quickened as she searched for Kelsey Prather, finding the same pattern. Kelsey Ann Prather, 27, of Free Soil, died March 18, 2011, preceded in death by her parents. No services, arrangements by. Each name, each record, a chilling echo of a pattern she had feared but never fully imagined. Brett's reach, his obsession, it had left a trail of lives erased, quietly, meticulously, until only shadows remained. And now Denise was standing on the edge, staring into the truth she couldn't ignore any longer. The air was heavy with heat and tension as Denise parked in front of the funeral home. Oak Grove. 2 names etched in cold stone. 2 women once alive, now gone. Both tied to Brett, both claimed by death without explanation. She felt bile rise before she even stepped inside the car, and by the time she reached her parents' house, she was barely standing. The bathroom door slammed behind her, and she emptied herself until nothing remained but raw emptiness. When she emerged, her mother was there, concern etched deep into her face. "What's happening, Denise?" She told her everything. The hookman, the binder of research, the eerie urban legends, Jessica Vann, Andrea Wilson, the obituaries she tracked down. Her mother listened, silent, absorbing every word. And when Denise finished, there was a long pause. Then her mother's expression shifted from worry to sharp realization. "He asked about you back in June," she said slowly. "About your panic attacks, your anxiety. He wasn't just worried. He was documenting you, building a story, making it seem like you were deteriorating all on your own. Did you see the binder?" Denise swallowed hard. "It's in his storage closet at my apartment. I can't get it, he has a key." Her mother's jaw tightened in a way Denise had never seen. "Then we go to the police. Now." The Mason County Sheriff's Office was a squat brick building on West Leadington Avenue, the kind of place where the scent of coffee and dust clung to everything. They sat in a small, cramped interview room. Deputy Kellerman, the same one from her earlier call, scribbled notes as she spoke, nodding but saying nothing. When she finished, he set down his pen, expression professional but unmoved. "There's nothing we can do," he said. "You can't access the binder. You can't prove the broadcast existed. The 2 women died of natural causes. Courtney Mayers from an overdose, Kelsey Prather in a car accident. Both cases were investigated and closed. Researching urban legends isn't illegal, and coincidences aren't evidence. If you find real proof of a crime, bring it in. Otherwise, the matter is closed." The interview ended. Outside, Denise's mother wrapped an arm around her, guiding her to the car in silence. The ride back to Cadillac was quiet, heavy with unspoken determination. Her father, who had stayed mostly silent until now, returned from the hardware store with a new deadbolt. Her mother called a locksmith. Plans were forming, slow and steady. At 7:00 p.m., they returned to Lincoln. Brett's Chevy was absent from the parking lot. Denise let herself into the apartment using her own key. He still had his, and immediately the air hit her. The faint, dark scent lingered, the unmistakable mark that he'd been there recently. Her mother stepped behind her, eyes sharp. "Get what you need," she said. Denise moved toward the storage closet. The lock was broken. The door hung awkwardly on its hinges. The box, the binder, all of Brett's college relics gone. She stood frozen, staring at the empty space, the hollow silence pressing in. Her mind struggled to accept the truth. Brett had been there. He had known they were coming, and whatever plan he had, it wasn't over. The moment her mother grabbed her arm, Denise knew there was no turning back. "We have to get out now." They raced toward the car, hearts hammering, adrenaline sharpening every sense. And then the shadow of a familiar Chevy slid into the lot. Brett stepped out, calm, deliberate. A slow smile stretched across his face. His hand reached into his pocket, and Denise's stomach dropped as she saw the glint of steel, a surgical hook, sharp enough to tear skin with a single swipe. Her mother shoved herself in front of Denise, dragging her toward the car, but Brett moved faster than humanly possible, cutting them off mid-step. "I really wish you hadn't been so curious, Denise," he said, voice smooth, almost affectionate. "We could have had everything. The wedding, the honeymoon, and then, well, accidents happen. People vanish. By then you'd have been so alone, no one would have noticed." Denise forced her voice to stay calm, precise, measured. If he was going to confess, she needed clarity, needed him to say it aloud like he had with Courtney. His eyes lit up, almost gleeful, as if proud to finally unmask his plan. Courtney was impatient, broke things off before stage 4. That was her mistake. And Kelsey, she tried to run. You saw how that ended. He spun the hook slowly in his hand, the streetlight catching its cold edge. "The thing is, I really did care about you, Denise. More than the others. That's why this is disappointing. The police know nothing. If they did, I'd be behind bars. But here I am, and you're coming with me. We're going for a drive, just like old times." Then her mother struck. Fast, explosive. Her shoulder slammed into Brett's chest, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself just in time. And in that split second, Denise's hand went to her purse. The pepper spray hissed through the air, striking Brett square in the face. He screamed, dropped the hook, clawed at his burning eyes, collapsing to his knees. They bolted. Her mother handed over the car keys. The engine roared to life, and they tore out of the lot, tires squealing as they hit the street. Denise dared a glance in the rearview mirror. Brett still knelt in the asphalt, screaming, hands pressed to his face, the hook abandoned beside him. They didn't stop until they reached the police station. This time, Deputy Kellerman listened. His easy, dismissive air vanished the moment Denise and her mother recounted the attack, showing the burns on their hands from the pepper spray and describing Brett wielding the hook. He set his coffee down carefully, eyes sharp, every muscle tense. "The hook, he actually had it with him," Denise nodded. Kellerman picked up his pen again, but this time his gaze didn't drift. Something in his expression had shifted, cop instinct piercing through months of red tape and bureaucracy. Start from the beginning, every detail, everything. 3 hours later, Brett was in custody at his apartment. Boxes upon boxes of research had been uncovered. Notes on urban legends, the infamous Hookman stories, other tales of terror meticulously cataloged, each page a record of obsession, proof of a man who had turned folklore into a frightening reality. The nightmare was finally over, but the echoes of it would linger far longer. When authorities finally raided Brett's apartment, what they uncovered was like stepping into the mind of a madman meticulously cataloging his crimes. Every relationship was mapped out in obsessive detail. Timelines, notes, reminders. Trophies from past victims littered the space. Delicate pieces of jewelry. A driver's license belonging to Courtney Mayers. A bracelet that once belonged to Kelsey Prather. A single, worn-down remote control sat on the shelf, smooth from endless handling, its original purpose now twisted into something sinister. And then there was the most horrifying discovery of all, a woman's hand, carefully wrapped in plastic in the freezer, identity unknown. The trial stretched for 3 harrowing weeks. Brett insisted on representing himself, grinning through every testimony, never a flicker of guilt crossing his face. 4 hours of deliberation were all it took for the jury to convict him on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The prosecution had aimed for first degree, but premeditation could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. 40 years. 40 years behind bars for a man who had turned love, trust, and human connection into a lethal game. Denise Carlson didn't wait to rebuild her life. She fled to Grand Rapids within 2 months, shedding her old name like a discarded skin, vanishing into anonymity. She never returned to the places where men might smile, where voices might coo gently and friendly eyes might deceive. Bars, parties, casual encounters, she avoided them all. Yet in the quiet of the night, when shadows press close and the wind rattles the window panes, she thinks about the legend Brett had weaponized. The Hookman story, once a harmless scare whispered around campfires, now forever tainted. She wonders how many other men have hidden their darkness behind a mask of charm, how many women have felt the scrape of a hook, never realizing the real danger sat beside them all along. The hook on the door wasn't a warning, it was a signature. By the time it appeared, stage 4 had already begun, and the nightmare was already written in blood. The moment they stepped inside, the air hit Julian like a wall, stale, heavy, tinged with something oddly sweet, like melted candy mixed with decay. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight cutting through cracked windows. The lobby smelled of mildew, of forgotten decades, of something faintly vanilla, as if ghosts of spilled sodas had seeped into the carpet and never left. Vera surged ahead, her red trench coat flaring around her knees, a bold slash of color against the faded golds and browns of the theater. Julian's footsteps echoed after her, hesitant, unsure. He tried to talk her out of coming, warning her the building was on the schedule for demolition in 3 weeks, but she had gripped his forearm with iron strength, her nails biting into fabric, eyes wide and fierce. "I have to see it one last time," she'd said. "One last time." As though the theater held a memory that only she could feel. Julian had none. He'd never been here. Not really. They crossed the threshold into the auditorium, and it was like entering a time capsule rotting in slow motion. The red velvet seats were shredded, stuffing spilling like open wounds. Water stains on the ceiling had twisted into grotesque shapes. Amoebas, lungs, maybe a face if you stared too long. Shadows clung to the corners like something alive. Vera didn't speak. She just moved, a magnetic force pulling Julian with her through the chaos of peeling paint and warped floorboards. Every step made the floorboards groan under their weight, and Julian could feel the past pressing in around him. Laughter, screams, popcorn raining down decades ago, all trapped in the decaying walls. Vera's eyes flicked over everything with an intensity that made Julian shiver. She wasn't just looking. She was remembering, though of what he couldn't say. At the far end of the room, the stage loomed like a silent judge. Curtains hung in tatters, the fabric grayed and stiff, and Julian noticed a thick layer of dust covering the wooden boards. Vera reached out, fingertips grazing the surface, tracing invisible lines, and Julian thought he saw a flicker of a smile, or maybe it was fear, cross her face. The theater wasn't just a building. It was a memory incubator, a prophecy trapped in plaster and timber, waiting for someone to notice. Julian swallowed, feeling the chill creep up his spine, the same whispering sense that whatever had lived here before wasn't entirely gone. And Vera, with her red coat and desperate insistence, seemed to know exactly what it wanted him to see. He followed her deeper into the shadows, knowing that in a place like this, some stories were never meant to stay buried, and some prophecies weren't meant to be bought at all. Story 2, Prophecy for Sale. The air inside was heavy, damp, and strangely sweet, like rot trying to disguise itself with perfume. Every breath carried the faint trace of something artificial, as though decades of spilled syrup had seeped into the carpet and refused to leave. Julian trailed behind Vera, his shoes sticking slightly to the faded lobby floor. The concession counter stood abandoned, its glass smeared with fingerprints long forgotten, rows of candy sealed in plastic like relics no one had touched in years. Vera didn't slow down. Her red coat, a blazing streak against the theater's decay, swung wildly with each determined step. That absurd coat, chosen in defiance of the California heat, seemed to burn with its own urgency. He had begged her not to come. The building was condemned, 3 weeks from being reduced to rubble. But when she clutched his arm, nails pressing crescents into his skin, her voice trembled with something deeper than nostalgia. One last time, she had whispered. One last time, though Julian couldn't recall ever being here before. The doors gave way to the cavernous auditorium, and the space consumed them whole. Rows of velvet seats sagged and split open, their insides spilling like wounds that would never heal. Above, the ceiling bore stains that had blossomed into grotesque shapes, shadows of lungs, drifting organisms, even faces that seemed to watch if you stared too long. Vera's hand tightened around his wrist, pulling him forward, deeper into the hollow heart of a place that felt less like a theater and more like a mausoleum of forgotten dreams. They moved down the center aisle, the silence pressing in from every side. The rows of seats seemed alive in their emptiness, hollow-eyed like abandoned houses that still remembered the families who once filled them. Vera stopped with surgical precision, 7 rows back, dead center, as though the spot had been chosen long ago. Her hand lifted, trembling, pointing to a single chair. Not fear exactly, but something close enough to make Julian's chest tighten. Anticipation, raw and electric, the kind that coils in the stomach before a storm breaks. He lowered himself beside her, the seat groaning under his weight, the armrest tacky with residue he refused to name. The curtain on stage sagged in tatters, a faded shroud draped over forgotten dreams. Behind it, the screen glowed faintly, as if it were a doorway leaking light from another world. Julian touched her shoulder, voice softened into the careful cadence he'd practiced these past weeks. They could leave. She didn't have to stay. But Vera's head shook once, sharply. Her eyes locked on the screen, pupils wide and black, swallowing the dim light until her gaze looked like 2 drilled holes. Tapped her watch. 317. Always 317. He checked his own 312. He promised himself he'd wait until 3:20, then invent some excuse to pull her out of this mausoleum. Already he was rehearsing the story he'd tell their friends, the devoted fiancé, patient enough to indulge her strange compulsions. They'd call him kind. They'd call him saintly. They'd say it at her funeral, voices heavy with admiration for the man who loved a difficult woman. The thought startled him with its clarity. At 3:60, the projector coughed awake. The sound cracked through the silence, a mechanical resurrection. Julian's head snapped up. The system was automated, some ancient timer still ticking long after its operators had vanished. But the sudden burst of light felt violent, stabbing through the dark. The screen flared alive. No opening credits, no prelude, just a hard cut to a woman's face, sharp with shadows and smoke. Vera's obsession. She had forced him to watch it over and over, pausing at random frames to dissect every flicker of expression, every glance that sealed a man's fate one choice at a time. Julian had found it lifeless, a relic embalmed in celluloid. He preferred the pulse of modern thrillers. But Vera's grip tightened. nails piercing skin until he felt the sting of blood. Her finger shot toward the screen, urgent, her lips moving in silent desperation. Julian's pulse thundered in his ears. He saw only the film two figures plotting, their faces etched in light and chemical shadow. He opened his mouth to speak, but her nails dug deeper, silencing him before the words could escape. Her nails dug deeper, anchoring him in place, while her other hand clamped against his jaw, forcing his gaze forward. The film carried on an ordinary scene, a man leaning in a doorway, smoke curling from his lips. But then the screen shifted. Not a glitch, not a blur. A perfect, steady image that didn't belong. Julian's breath caught. Their bedroom. Morning light slicing across Vera's body as she stood by the window, bare skin glowing in the pale warmth. She was laughing, soft, unguarded, and beside her on the screen, Julian was laughing too. Silent but unmistakably him. The frame lingered just long enough for him to notice the ugly print on the wall, the one Vera had insisted on hanging despite his protests. Another cut, their kitchen. Papers scattered across the table, Vera bent over her laptop. He watched himself enter, watched his own hands place a mug of coffee before her with deliberate care. She looked up at him then, eyes brimming with a tenderness he couldn't remember seeing in years. His chest tightened, a painful reminder of something lost. The vision dissolved, swallowed back into the film. Vera made a sound, low, primal, almost wounded. Julian gripped the armrests, his mind scrambling for explanations. Malfunction, hallucination, some trick of light. But his body knew better. His pulse thundered, his skin prickled. The movie continued, but between its cuts, another story bled through. Their story. Vera and Julian cooking together, laughing in bed, tangled in sheets, waiting in line at the DMV, pulling faces at each other to pass the time. Ordinary moments, stitched together like fragments of a life only they had lived. Then the reel changed again. Vera remained, her hair, her jawline, her unmistakable presence, but the setting was different. A city street. Julian recognized it instantly. 7th and Broadway, the corner where the bus always turned. On screen, Vera stepped off the curb, her red coat blazing like a wound against the gray. The bus appeared without warning, massive, unstoppable. The collision was silent, yet devastating. Her body lifted, weightless, almost graceful, before crashing down with a finality that needed no sound. The coat spread across the pavement like spilled paint. In the corner of the frame, a date burned into the image, March 20th. Next week. Julian's stomach dropped. Vera's hand tightened around his, and he felt her trembling pulse echo inside his own. Her nails tore deeper into his skin, sharp crescents filling with blood. The sound spilling from her throat was no longer human speech, just a raw, broken keening that scraped against the silence. Julian tried to wrench free, shaking his head, but her grip was unyielding, forged from desperation. His own thoughts spiraled, chasing logic, but every calculation collapsed under the weight of what he'd seen. Reality itself was slipping. The splice ended. The film returned to its familiar shadows, two doomed figures whispering schemes. But Julian couldn't follow their story anymore. His mind was busy running equations, searching for a rational thread, a hidden projector, a feed from Vera's laptop, some trick of technology. Impossible. The theater had been dead for months, its only heartbeat the timer that still forced the reels to spin. A prank. But who would orchestrate something so elaborate, and why here, why now? He had seen it. Their bedroom, their kitchen, Vera's death, not imagined scene. And the film kept cutting back, each splice replaying the same horror from new angles. Vera stepping into the street, the bus striking, her body folding against asphalt while traffic streamed around her like water around stone. Always the red coat blazing like a wound. The original movie reached its end, its characters undone by their own choices. But the projector refused to stop. More splices bled through, police tape fluttering, a body sealed in black plastic, a woman sobbing outside the morgue, Vera's mother, a stranger to Julian until now. Then Julian himself on screen, hollow-eyed, wandering through an apartment stripped of Vera's presence. His face gaunt, his movements slow, like a man drifting through ruins. The final splice, a coffin, polished wood, drowning in flowers. Julian in a black suit accepting condolences from faces he didn't recognize. The screen flared white. The projector sputtered, then died. The house lights stayed dark. Julian sat frozen, Vera's nails still embedded in his arm, her breath ragged beside him. His own chest rose shallow, each inhale tight with dread. Something immense was forming in his mind, a truth too vast to name, pressing closer like headlights bearing down from the edge of vision. Vera lurched to her feet, staggering toward the aisle. Julian steadied her as she staggered into the aisle, her body trembling like a wire pulled too tight. Her eyes were wide, drowning, the whites circling her irises as though she'd been pulled somewhere far beyond him. Her hands moved in frantic shapes, locking doors, staying inside, tearing off the red coat, discarding it forever. He understood. March 20th. She would not step outside. She would not wear that coat. When she finally looked at him, her gaze was the hollow kind people wear when reality has slipped its grip. Her fingers dug into his arms, demanding an answer without words. Julian heard himself promise, yes, he would keep her safe. The days that followed dragged like a nightmare that refused to end. He kept Vera inside, his willpower reinforced with carefully measured doses of medication, just enough to soften her edges without making her suspicious. She abandoned her job, ignored her phone, and sat by the window in his old t-shirt, staring at the street below as though it might rise up and claim her. Julian carried on with his own routines, lectures, grading, faculty meetings, performing normalcy so convincingly that colleagues praised his resilience. Given the circumstances, they said, as if Vera's unraveling were some external misfortune rather than a storm they were trapped inside together. He told no one about the theater. How could he? That an abandoned palace of film had shown them the future, that its reels had predicted his fiancée's death. At night, while Vera slept under the haze of her medication, Julian sat alone in his study, turning the thought over and over until its edges cut him. The film hadn't only shown her end, it had shown him afterward, alone, grieving, standing beside a coffin so lavish it seemed impossible. He opened his laptop, searching funeral costs in Lowe's Angels. 8 to 12,000 for the casket, thousands more for flowers. That kind of ceremony meant money neither of them had. His fingers hovered, then typed, Vera Ostrovsky Life Insurance. He'd known vaguely about the policy, a benefit from her job, but never studied the details. The number glared back at him, 3 million. Beneficiary, Julian Carver, spouse or domestic partner. They weren't married yet, not until June. But California law recognized partnerships after a certain time. 14 months together. Enough. Julian closed the laptop. Darkness pressed in. Outside, Lowe's Angels hummed with its endless machinery of life. Thousands of strangers moving through the night. While inside, Julian sat still, the weight of inevitability settling over him like a shroud. Crowds outside carried on with their ordinary routines, blind to the fact that reality itself had fractured inside a rotting theater on a forgotten Tuesday. For Julian, the shape of it was undeniable now. The fragments he'd seen weren't random, they were a sequence. Love, loss, aftermath. A complete narrative carved into celluloid. And that story carried a truth his rational mind fought against, even as something primal inside him accepted it. Vera would die on March 20th, and he would inherit her absence in the form of money. He imagined the investigators, their suspicions sharp as knives. A fiancé collecting millions days after discovering he was the beneficiary. It would reek of motive. They would dissect his life, searching for intent. Unless her death appeared inevitable, unless there was proof he couldn't have stopped it. Julian opened his laptop, fingers trembling as he began to write. By dawn, the plan was etched into existence. The morning before March 19th, he cooked carefully poached eggs, toasted sourdough, fresh juice. Vera had stopped eating properly and he needed her clear-headed. He carried the tray into their bedroom where she had built a fortress of pillows and blankets around herself. She eyed the food with suspicion, lips moving. Tomorrow. I'm staying here, not leaving. Julian placed the tray gently on her lap, sat beside her and nodded. He'd stay too. He canceled his classes. Relief flickered across her face, fragile and fleeting. He touched her hand, let his voice soften with concern. He told her he worried about the theater, about how it was consuming her. Maybe they should talk to someone. Her hand recoiled, her eyes sharp with hurt. She thought he believed she was broken. He shook his head quickly. No, what she'd experienced was traumatic. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. Her fear was real. That was enough. He'd rehearsed this response, the perfect balance of validation without surrender. She picked at her eggs, then lifted her gaze. What if we left? Not just stayed inside, but really left, drove up the coast, spent the day somewhere far away. If we weren't in the city, it couldn't happen. Julian had expected this. He leaned forward, voice calm, deliberate. The visions hadn't only shown downtown. They had shown what came after his life continuing without her. If the film was truly prophecy, would geography change fate? Or would it simply shift the place where it happened? He watched her face as the thought sank in, watched the fragile spark of hope collapse into despair. She whispered something so faint he almost missed it. Then there's nothing I can do. Julian leaned closer, ready to deliver the words he had already prepared. The desperation in the air was thick enough to choke on. Julian pressed the issue, his voice tight. They needed a failsafe, a frantic what if. Suppose the worst happens. Suppose the prophecy is real. They needed a timeline, a paper trail proving they had seen the end coming and done everything humanly possible to rewrite it. We have to go back, he insisted. Not all the way in, just to the entrance. We need to set the stage. Vera recoiled, shaking her head violently. The mere thought paralyzed her. Just the lobby, Julian pleaded, softening his tone. We create a timestamp. We prove that tomorrow you are nowhere near a road. We document the lockdown. We prove we fought back. She stared at him, her eyes wide and swimming with unspoken terror. When she finally spoke, the silence between them was deafening. She wasn't asking if the tragedy would strike. She was terrified of when. If we lose, Julian started, then corrected himself. If the unthinkable happens, we leave a record. We show the world we didn't just walk into the fire. He watched her internal struggle, the way she searched for a reason to refuse, a hole in his logic. But there wasn't one. It was a grim necessity. Slowly, painfully, she dipped her chin in agreement. They waited until the world slept. Vera demanded it. Midnight felt safer, far removed from the daylight hours when the vision claimed her life would end. They took his car, rolling silently into the desolate lot where the pavement was cracked and surrendered to wild overgrowth. The theater loomed ahead, a hollow shell against the night sky. It was devoid of electricity, devoid of soul, a concrete tomb waiting for occupants. Vera froze at the threshold. She wouldn't take a single step past the glass doors of the lobby, hugging her chest as if trying to hold herself together. Julian moved past her, walking toward the black maw of the auditorium. He placed a hand on the swinging doors. They gave way silently, drifting open with an unnatural ease that betrayed the building's decay. He peered into the abyss. The rows of tattered seats, the water-stained ruins of the ceiling, the blank, towering screen. It was all there, submerged in shadow. But the air felt heavy. It felt occupied. Julian had the distinct crawling sensation that the screen wasn't just a surface, but an unblinking eye waiting for the show to start. He pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly, and hit record. The red light blinked to life. My name is Julian Carver. The date is March 19th. The time is 12:14 a.m. He turned the lens toward the shadows, his voice echoing thin and fragile in the cavernous space. I am standing in the lobby of the Orpheum with my fiancée, Vera. 1 week ago, while watching an old film in this very room, Vera was forced to witness a premonition. She saw a detailed, vivid hallucination of her own death in a collision, slated for tomorrow, March 20th. He paused, the weight of the words settling like lead. We are making this recording to state for the record that we are aware. We are taking extreme measures. Tomorrow, Vera will be in total lockdown inside our home on Kenmore Avenue. From the stroke of midnight until the day is gone, we will not step foot outside. I will be her witness and her guard. He swung the camera around, catching a glimpse of Vera, a fragile silhouette against the moonlight, the rotting concession stand, and the gaping mouth of the auditorium behind him. We are rewriting the ending, he whispered to the lens. If anything happens to us, this footage proves we did everything right. If anything happens, it wasn't because we were careless. Julian. Vera's voice cut through his monologue, sharp, breathless, and laced with absolute terror. He spun around. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was locked on the concession stand, staring through the Grime Street safety glass. Julian kept the phone raised, the red recording light still blinking as he moved toward the counter. There, resting on the dust-covered surface, was a splash of violent color. It was a trench coat, her trench coat, the same blood-red garment she had sworn to destroy, the one Julian had watched her bury in the back of their hallway closet 3 days ago. It was folded with military precision, pristine and bright against the gray decay of the abandoned lobby. Vera let out a sound that wasn't quite human, a high, thin keen of pure distress. She didn't wait for an explanation. She scrambled backward, turned on her heel, and sprinted into the night. The heavy thud of a car door slamming shut echoed through the empty building moments later. Julian stood frozen, alone in the silence. He forced himself to step closer, shoving his camera phone right up against the glass. Narrating for the record, his voice wavered. That is Vera's coat, the one we left at home. It's physically impossible for it to be here. He kept the camera rolling as he backed out of the theater. In the parking lot, the car was idling. Vera was curled into a ball in the passenger seat, hyperventilating, rocking back and forth. Julian climbed in, his own hands shaking, and held the screen up to her face. Look at it, he commanded gently. You have to see it, it's real. She sobbed, her breath hitching. Who is doing this to me? Who is trying to break my mind? Who? Julian asked. But the question hung dead in the air. There was no who. There was only the Orpheum, silent and waiting, rewriting reality to fit its script. The drive back to the apartment was a blur of white knuckles and silence. Julian dosed her with sleeping aids and sat by the bed until her breathing grew heavy and rhythmic. Once she was under, he walked out to the hallway. He stared at the closet door. He gripped the handle, his heart hammering against his ribs, and threw it open. The red trench coat was there, hanging exactly where she had stuffed it, cold, untouched. The theater hadn't stolen it, the theater had manifested it. March 20th arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating gray light. The day of the prophecy. Julian turned the living room into a bunker. He brewed a pot of strong coffee and set up a laptop in the corner, its webcam unblinking, capturing every second of their lockdown. Vera finally drifted out of the bedroom at 10:00 a.m. She looked hollowed out like a shell of a person, but the hysteria was gone. In its place was a numb, terrifying resignation. She was dressed in the colors of a ghost, baggy gray sweatpants, a plain white t-shirt. She had stripped herself of color, no red, not even a stitch. They camped on the sofa, knees pulled to chests. Julian sat close enough to feel her warmth, but he didn't touch her. The laptop recorded the silence. On the TV, morning news cycled into afternoon talk shows, a stream of noise neither of them actually heard. They didn't eat. They barely moved. Around 2:00 p.m., Vera stood up and walked to the bathroom. Julian hit pause on the recording, a small mercy of privacy. When she came back out, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She looked at him, and for the first time in days, her eyes were clear. It wasn't relief, it was clarity. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've been so patient with me." Julian reached out, taking her cold hand in his. "I love you, Vera." She tilted her head, studying his face like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The look in her eyes was genuinely curious. "Do you?" she asked. "Really?" A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window crawled up Julian's spine. He nodded, perhaps a fraction too quickly. "Of course I do." Vera held his gaze for a long, uncomfortable second, dissecting the lie, before she turned away and sank back into the couch. Julian restarted the recording, his eyes flicking to the digital clock on the stove. 3:17 p.m. The minute lasted an eternity. Then it ticked over to 3:18. Silence. The ceiling didn't collapse. The windows didn't shatter. The world kept spinning. At 4:00 p.m., the dam broke. Vera started to giggle. It was a wet, jagged sound that quickly spiraled into full-blown hysteria, her body shaking as she purged 8 days of pure terror. Julian let her crumble. He sat there, grinning like a fool, squeezing her hand until his knuckles turned white. They had won. The script was broken. But as the laughter died down, a strange heaviness settled in the room. The air felt dense, pressurized like the atmosphere inside a submarine diving too deep. Julian checked the locks again. Everything was sealed. By 6:00 p.m., the adrenaline crash left Vera starving. For the first time in a week, she had an appetite. They ordered Thai food, her comfort meal. When it arrived, she ate with a ferocious, messy enthusiasm, sauce on her cheek, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. They had cheated death. The delivery had arrived at 6:23 p.m. Julian noted the time, grabbing the bags and slamming the door shut instantly. He was still on guard. At 7:15 p.m., the truce ended. Vera stood up, wiping her mouth. She needed her laptop. It was in the trunk of the car, forgotten since yesterday. Julian's radar went off immediately. He shot up, blocking her path. No, we agreed, midnight to midnight. We don't leave this apartment. Vera pulled her arm away, her eyes flashing with annoyance. The fear was gone, replaced by the stubborn, independent woman he had proposed to. Julian stopped. It's past 3:17. The sun is setting. It's over. I'll get it, he pleaded. Just tell me where it is. I am not an invalid, she snapped. Her voice was hard, cutting through his protectiveness. I am going to walk 30 feet to the curb, get my bag, and come back. That is it. She didn't wait for his permission. She shoved past him and threw open the apartment door. Julian scrambled after her, his arguments dying in his throat as they spilled out of the building lobby. The evening air hit him, but it didn't feel fresh. It felt wrong, static. Their street was a quiet residential dead end. No traffic, no chaos. Just the Camry parked 20 feet away, bathing in the orange glow of the streetlights. See, Vera called back, digging for her keys. Fine. Julian followed her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She reached the bumper, popped the trunk, and leaned in to grab the leather strap of her bag. That's when Julian heard it. A roar, low, mechanical, and getting louder. It was coming from the left, from the main avenue. Julian whipped his head around just as the machine tore around the corner. It wasn't a car, it was a city bus, number 42. It was taking the turn way too wide, tires screeching against the asphalt. Through the massive windshield, time seemed to slow down. Julian could see the driver perfectly. A young guy, barely 20. He wasn't looking at the road. His head was bowed, eyes locked on a phone resting in his lap, completely blind to the tragedy he was steering. The bus didn't swerve, it climbed. The massive tires crushed the curb, mounting the sidewalk with a sickening, grinding lurch. Time fractured. The world moved in stuttering frames, too fast to process, yet agonizingly slow to watch. Julian's scream died in his throat, a silent choke. Vera straightened up, turning toward the noise. There was no fear on her face, only a childlike confusion. Then physics took over. The impact was brutal. It lifted her off her feet with a terrifying grace, a dark ballet that ended with her body slamming against the asphalt with finality. The bus didn't stop immediately. It pushed forward, dragging her 12 feet, leaving a dark streak on the road and a permanent scar on Julian's soul. The silence that followed was shattered by the driver's screams as he stumbled out of the bus. A kid realizing he just ended a life for a text message. Neighbors flooded the street. Hands grabbed Julian, holding him back, keeping him from the ruin of his fiancée. Then came the sirens, the flashing red and blue strobe lights. Paramedics rushed in, performing the grim pantomime of rescue, working feverishly on a body that everyone knew was already gone. A uniform materialized in front of Julian. A cop asked what happened. Julian heard his own voice answering, distant and hollow. He explained the irony, how she was terrified of this exact moment, how they had spent the entire day hiding, how she had stepped outside for less than 60 seconds. He sounded credible because every word was the truth. That's what made it so cruel. Hours later, time had lost all texture. He was standing in a cold, sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and death. They asked him to identify her. They pulled back the sheet. It was Vera. Her face was bruised, broken, but undeniably her. But it was what she was wearing that stopped Julian's heart. The gray sweatpants were gone. The white t-shirt was gone. She was wrapped in the red trench coat. The same coat he had watched her bury in the closet 9 days ago. The same coat that had impossibly appeared in the theater lobby. The same coat that, hours ago was hanging untouched in their hallway. The detective scribbled in a notepad, his brow furrowed. Did she often wear that coat, even if she was afraid? I don't know, Julian whispered, the lie tasting like ash. Maybe she thought she was safe. The detective nodded, closing the book on the impossible. Julian signed the papers. He took the condolences. He moved through the bureaucratic nightmare like a sleepwalker. He returned to the apartment. It was a tomb now, silent, empty. He sat in the dark living room, staring at nothing. Then a pale blue light caught his eye. The laptop. It was still open on the coffee table, the webcam still staring blindly into the room. He had forgotten to stop the recording. He pulled the computer onto his lap and scrubbed through the timeline. He watched the ghosts of their day. He saw them huddled on the couch. He saw Vera stand up at 2:00 p.m. heading for the bathroom. He watched his own hand reach out and hit the spacebar. Pause. He dragged the cursor forward. The video resumed. Vera was sitting back down. He frowned. He rewound it. He checked the timestamps. The video paused at 2:00 p.m. It resumed at 2:07 p.m. There were 7 minutes missing. 7 minutes of unrecorded time. 7 minutes where the camera was blind. 7 minutes where Vera had been alone in that bathroom, or somewhere else entirely. Julian sat in the suffocating darkness, the truth rising in his mind not like a spark, but like a slow, drowning tide. She had gone to the closet. She had retrieved the coat. She had hidden it in the car during those missing 7 minutes. Vera hadn't just succumbed to the prophecy, she had facilitated it. She believed in the vision so absolute that she engineered the final details herself, ensuring the loop closed. Or, and this thought curdled in his stomach, she was testing the universe, daring fate to strike her down. It didn't matter which was true, the result was the same. The funeral was a precise reenactment of the horror movie they had watched. The casket was polished mahogany, closed tight to hide the ruin the bus had made of her. The room was choking with lilies. Julian had bought every single arrangement the vision had shown him, terrified that changing even a petal might trigger a punishment worse than death. Vera's mother collapsed into his arms exactly on cue, sobbing into a handkerchief, whispering about how lucky Vera was to have been loved by a man so devoted. Strangers filled the pews, faces from her past, co-workers, old friends. They looked at Julian and saw a man destroyed by grief. They were right, but they didn't understand the nature of the destruction. The insurance settlement hit his bank account with cold, brutal efficiency. $3 million minus taxes, a literal fortune exchanged for a life. There were no questions asked. Why would there be? The police report was airtight. 17 witnesses saw the bus driver, distracted by his phone, plow through the intersection. Security cameras captured Vera stepping off the curb. They captured Julian lunging for her, screaming her name, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve just a second too late. It was a tragedy. It was an accident. It was perfect. Julian resigned from the university the next week. The department chair nodded sympathetically, murmuring about time to heal, and handed him a card signed by people who didn't know what to say. He put the apartment on the market. He sold the furniture. He packed the remnants of his life into cardboard boxes, stripping the walls bare until the place looked as empty as he felt. Then came April. 6 weeks after the collision, 6 weeks of silence. Julian was tapping up the final box when his phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a text from an unlisted number. The Orpheum. Julian stared at the screen, his blood running cold. He went to delete it, his thumb hovering over the trash icon, when a second message pushed through. Vera's death wasn't an accident. You need to see. He didn't think. He grabbed his keys and drove. The theater should have been a pile of rubble by now, but the city was slow. Demolition permits had snagged on red tape, leaving the building standing, a rotting tooth in the jaw of the neighborhood. It waited for him, patient and silent. The parking lot was a wasteland of weeds and broken glass, empty save for one vehicle. Parked near the entrance was a rusted, battered sedan with mud-splattered out-of-state plates. Julian pulled up beside it and killed the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening to the ticking of his cooling car, staring at the dark doors of the cinema. He sat in the idling car for a long time, the engine vibration humming through his hands, telling himself he could just put it in reverse and drive away. He could leave the truth buried in the rubble, but the pull was too strong, a magnetic force dragging him back to the scene of the crime. He stepped out, walking through the shattered glass of the entrance. He moved like a sleepwalker down the center aisle, finding the exact same seat, row 7, dead center. The theater hadn't changed. It was still a rotting cathedral of water-stained velvet and decaying plaster. The screen hung in the gloom, a pale, silent monolith. But the silence was broken. You came. The voice came from behind him. Julian stiffened, turning slowly. 3 rows back sat a man who looked like he had been eroded by years of bad luck. He was in his 50s, clutching a remote control with trembling fingers, his eyes rimmed with red. You're the boyfriend, the stranger said. It wasn't a question. I feel like I know you. I've spent the last month staring at your face, cutting it, pasting it, making it say things you never said. Julian's throat felt like sandpaper. Who are you? Raise, the man spat. I was the projectionist. Vera hired me. Raise laughed, a dry, humorless sound. She paid me $25,000 cash. She told me she wanted to stage a supernatural experience, an elaborate prank, performance art. I didn't care. I took the money. But now she's dead, or she isn't. And I'm sitting here realizing I'm either an accessory to insurance fraud or an accomplice to murder. He raised the remote, pointing it at the booth above. I need you to see this. I need you to understand that I was just the technician. The machinery overhead roared to life. A beam of harsh, white light sliced through the dusty air, hitting the screen with blinding clarity. The image stabilized. It wasn't a noir film this time. It was a domestic scene. It was Julian's dining room. The timestamp read March 2nd, weeks before the nightmare began. On the screen, Julian saw himself. He was sitting at the table, leaning forward, his face animated with a dark excitement. Across from him sat Vera. Between them lay a map of the city and a stack of bus schedules. The real Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the armrests until his fingernails threatened to snap. On screen, the digital Julian pointed to a specific intersection. He traced a line with his finger. He nodded as Vera laid the red trench coat on the table, smoothing the fabric like it was a sacred artifact. They looked like partners in crime. They looked like they were rehearsing a play. I don't remember this, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. I never did this. Of course you didn't, Reyes said from the dark. It's a deepfake Julian, high-end synthetic media. The image on the screen shifted. Now Julian was handing Vera the keys, smiling a cold, knowing smile. She bugged your apartment, Reyes explained, his voice thick with guilt. She gave me terabytes of raw footage, hidden cameras in your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room. She gave me your voice, your mannerisms, your face. I fed it all into the machine. I made you a digital puppet. I edited reality to make it look like you were in on it from day one. The image on the screen flickered and jumped to a new setting. It was bright, harsh daylight. Julian was sitting in his car, parked directly in front of the county clerk's office. Julian stared at the screen, his stomach churning. He had never been to the county clerk. He had never sat in that spot. "It's a fabrication," Ray said, his voice flat. "Every single pixel. This was her insurance policy, Julian. If you hesitated, if you refused to hand over the payout, or if you tried to go to the cops, she had this. Hours of footage proving you were the mastermind. You go to prison for fraud and conspiracy. She'd walk away with the money as the grieving victim of a manipulative partner." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because she played me too," Ray snapped. "She made me an accessory to a felony without giving me the script. And then I saw the news. I saw the obituary. I realized that if that body in the morgue isn't really her, then I helped stage a murder. And if she is alive, do you think she's going to let the only two witnesses walk free?" He pointed the remote at the screen again. His hand was shaking. "I have to show you the end game. She told me to keep this file hidden. I was only supposed to send it to you if you started asking questions after the payout. It was her final threat." Ray pressed the button. The gloomy interior of the theater vanished, replaced by blinding white light. The screen showed a paradise, a sprawling white stucco villa with a red tile roof overlooking a turquoise ocean. Mexico, maybe, or somewhere even harder to find. On screen, a tanned, relaxed Julian walked into the frame. He was wearing expensive sunglasses and holding a tropical cocktail. He looked happy. He looked free. Then Vera walked in. She was alive, vibrantly, undeniably alive. She wore a white sundress that caught the ocean breeze. She walked up to the digital Julian, wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. They laughed, a sound of pure contentment. She stepped inside the villa. The camera followed her through the open glass doors. The digital Julian stayed on the balcony, looking at the view. Inside, Vera's smile vanished. Her face went cold, calculating. She poured 2 glasses of champagne. Then she opened a small, silver locket hanging around her neck. She tapped a fine white powder into one of the flutes and swirled it until it dissolved. The digital Julian walked in from the heat. He took the glass from her hand. He raised it in a toast to their new life. He drank. The change was instant. The smile slid off his face. He grabbed his throat, eyes bulging in confusion and betrayal. The glass smashed against the tiled floor. He collapsed, convulsing. Vera didn't scream. She didn't cry. She watched him die with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. She checked his pulse to ensure he was gone. Then she pulled a phone from her pocket and began to wipe down the table with a napkin. The screen cut to black. Julian sat in the dark, paralyzed by the horror of it. "That wasn't a deep fake," Reyes whispered from the darkness behind him. "I mean, the video was fake, but the plan wasn't. She dictated that scene to me. She wanted you to see it. It was a message. Even if you figure it out, even if you try to run, you don't survive this." "But you're showing me," Julian said, his voice trembling. "Why?" "Because the plan is broken," Reyes said, standing up. The chair creaked loudly in the silence. "Either she's dead or she's gone. If she's alive, you aren't in Mexico, so she doesn't have her money yet. If she's dead, then someone needs to know what kind of monster she was. He walked down the aisle, clutching a hard drive. I'm giving you the source files, the raw data, the metadata, every splice, every edit, every proof that she framed you. It's the key to your freedom. In exchange for what? Julian asked. Cash, Ray said, his eyes darting toward the exit. Enough to get me out of the state before the loose ends get tied up. I need $200,000, Ray said. His voice was low, devoid of negotiation. That's half of what she promised me for the job. It's the price of a ghost. It's enough for me to vanish properly. He stepped out from the row of seats, standing right at the edge of Julian's aisle. We take the money and we disappear. Different hemispheres, different names. Because if Vera is still out there breathing air, then we are just loose ends waiting to be cut. Julian looked up at him, his face hard. And if I refuse, if I tell you to get lost, then I go to the cops, Ray's replied, his shrug terrifyingly casual. I confess. I tell them about the deepfakes, the fraud, the setup. I'll go to prison, absolutely, but you're coming with me. Ray's offered a grim, bloodless smile. Because how exactly do you prove those videos are fake when they're good enough to fool a forensic team? Vera built you a perfect, windowless cell, Julian. I'm just offering you the key to the door. Julian sat in the silence, the weight of the $3 million in his account pressing down on him. He thought about the woman he loved, or the monster who wore her face. He looked around the Orpheum. For weeks, he believed this rotting theater was a supernatural conduit. Now, he saw the strings. Vera had weaponized his superstition. She had taken his tendency to see patterns in the chaos and turned it into a noose. She had shown him two futures, her death and his murder. Both were lies, but the trap was real. Julian stood up. He extended his hand. Ray's took it. The pact was sealed. The files are on a hard drive in my car, Ray said, the tension draining from his shoulders. I'll wire the money tonight, Julian said. Any offshore account you want, and then we never speak again. Agreed. If she's alive, she'll be hunted. They walked toward the lobby together, two pawns realizing they had been playing on someone else's chessboard the entire time. But at the glass doors, Ray stopped. He stared back into the gloom. You know, the terrifying part is, I still don't know if she's actually dead. I saw the news. I saw the obituary. But I also know her mind. She paid me to make that video of you dying in Mexico. She called it a contingency plan. But what if it wasn't? Julian trailed off, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. What if it was a fence? What if she showed me my own death to ensure I'd never run? To make sure I was too paralyzed by fear to touch the money, leaving it sitting there for her to come back and claim. They stood in the dusty lobby, united by a horrifying ambiguity. They would never know. Vera had constructed a mystery with no answer key, a labyrinth with no exit. Julian looked back at the auditorium one last time. The screen was dark, patient. She turned this place into a weapon, he whispered. She turned reality into a weapon, Ray's replied softly. That's just what she was. Julian walked out of the Orpheum for the last time. He climbed into his car and drove until the city was a blur in his rearview mirror. The theater watched him go, and Julian couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere behind a different screen, Vera was watching too. Singapore was a different world. It was humid, blindingly bright, and mercifully loud. A city of neon and noise where ghosts had no place to hide. Julian rented a modest apartment in a nondescript high-rise, burying himself in a new identity. He used the insurance money sparingly, withdrawing just enough to survive without tripping any digital alarms. He was a ghost in a city of millions. But the encrypted hard drive, his supposed insurance policy, was heavier than it looked. When Julian finally decrypted the files, the cold reality washed over him. It was hours of raw footage, yes. It revealed the digital stitchwork, the deepfake layers, the fabrication of the prophecy. But it lacked the one thing that mattered, a connection to Vera. Reyes had never met her. He had only communicated with a faceless user named Vichen via encrypted apps that deleted messages instantly. There was no paper trail, no smoking gun. If Julian went to the police with this drive, it wouldn't exonerate him. A smart prosecutor would twist it. They would say Julian hired the projectionist to create an elaborate alibi, that he staged the supernatural events to cover up a murder. Vera had constructed a trap so brilliant that even the evidence of her crime looked like proof of his guilt. 3 months bled away. Julian lived a half-life, scouring the internet through VPNs, hunting for news from Lowe's Angels. He checked obituaries, missing person reports, police blotters, anything that might hint that Vera had resurfaced. There was nothing. The book was closed. The official narrative was set in stone, accidental death. The bus driver was facing manslaughter charges. Julian had been cleared. His devastation on camera serving as his strongest defense. Vera's mother had insisted on a closed casket funeral and immediate cremation. Her ashes were scattered in the Pacific. If the body in that box wasn't Vera, then who was it? A Jane Doe from the morgue, an overdose victim dragged off the streets of Portland to serve as a prop in Vera's Grand Theater. The thought that Vera had burned a stranger's body to fuel her escape made Julian physically ill. He tried to push the image away, but it haunted his sleep. Then came a morning in July. Julian walked into his living room and froze. Lying on the floorboards just inside the front door was a single photograph. It had been slid underneath the gap while he slept. There was no note, no threat, just the image. It was Vera. She was sitting at a sidewalk cafe, bathed in sunlight. Her hair was cut short and dyed black. She wore oversized sunglasses, but the curve of her jaw was unmistakable. It was her, alive, unhurt. Julian flipped the photo over. It was time-stamped, yesterday. The metadata was still embedded in the file. The location wasn't Mexico. It wasn't Europe. She was in Singapore. She was in his city. She was likely in his neighborhood. Julian sat on the edge of his rented bed, the photograph trembling in his hand. The waiting was over. The suffocating silence was broken. He had a binary choice. He could pack a bag, drain his cash reserves, and run again. He could assume a new name, find a new hole in the wall, and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for her to get bored or run out of money. Or he could stop being the pawn. He could turn the trap around. He decided to turn the weapon around. He could have run. He could have taken the remaining cash and dissolved into the humidity of Southeast Asia, spending the rest of his life flinching at shadows. But he didn't, because running was just another form of the prison she had built for him, and because a dark, jagged part of him, the part that had stared into the abyss of the Orpheum, needed to see her. He needed to look her in the eye. He needed to know if she had snapped the neck of that Jane Doe herself, or if she had merely purchased a corpse like a prop. He needed to know if she felt even a flicker of remorse. He pulled up the photo on his phone and typed a reply. Same cafe, tomorrow, noon. She arrived precisely on time. Vera looked refined. The softness of her California life had been chiseled away, leaving something sharper, harder. 3 months of being dead had agreed with her. She wore crisp white linen and dark, oversized sunglasses, ordering her coffee with the bored elegance of a woman who had nothing to fear. They sat at a wrought iron table in the heat. To the passers-by, they were just two expats escaping the sun. To each other, they were ghosts haunting the same city. Julian didn't waste breath on small talk. He leaned forward, his voice low. "The woman in the box, did you kill her, or was she just a purchase?" Vera took a slow sip of her latte. She set the cup down without a tremor. "Does the distinction actually matter, Julian?" "It matters to me." "She was an overdose," Vera said, her voice clinical. "She was already gone. I simply intercepted the process before cremation. I dressed her. I staged her. I made sure she was wearing the coat you were terrified of. I made sure the damage was severe enough that a grieving fiancé wouldn't look too closely." Julian felt a wave of nausea, but he swallowed it down. "And the driver, the kid on the bus, did you pay him to crush you?" "No," Vera said, shaking her head. "That was just probability. I didn't bribe anyone. I just watched. I studied the routes. I knew which drivers were reckless, which ones checked their phones, which ones were tired. I didn't cause the accident. I just placed myself in a spot where an accident was statistically inevitable. The universe did the heavy lifting." "I need to know," Julian whispered, the question burning his throat. "Did it go wrong? Did the bus hit harder than you planned? Did the real Vera die on that asphalt and I'm sitting here with a copy?" Vera smiled. It was a cold, empty expression that didn't touch her eyes. "You're being dramatic. The body in the morgue was the girl from Portland. I walked away without a scratch. You identified the wrong corpse because you saw what you expected to see. The insurance company paid out because you were the perfect witness. It was a masterpiece, Julian, flawless, except for one loose thread." She leaned back, her gaze hardening. "You never came to Mexico. You never brought the money." "I didn't bring the money," Julian said, his voice steadying, "because I found the backstage pass. I found the laptop, the deepfakes, the psychological profiles you wrote about me. I know everything, Vera." Vera didn't flinch. Her smile actually widened, curling at the edges with amusement. "You found the files?" she asked softly. "Did you really? Why hadn't I gone to the police?" The question hung in the humid air between them. The answer was brutal in its simplicity. Because the handcuffs would have clicked onto my wrists just as fast as hers. Her forgery was a masterpiece. The deepfakes painted me as a co-conspirator, and any proof I had that she framed me could be easily spun as a guilty partner trying to cut a deal. She had sealed every exit. So I did what she taught me. I stopped reacting and started planning. I reached into my bag and slid a thick manila envelope across the table. It hit the metal surface with a heavy, final thud. "Inside," I said, keeping my voice level, "is a copy of everything, the schematics, the psychological profiles you wrote on me, the bank transfers to the projectionist, every single pixel of your fraud." I leaned in closer. "It's all timestamped, notarized by a digital forensics expert here in the city, and more importantly, it's sitting on a secure cloud server with a dead man's switch." Vera stared at the envelope, her face a mask of stone. "If I don't check in every 7 days," I continued, "the system executes a mass release. The LAPD gets it. The insurance investigators get it. Your mother gets it. The press gets it. Everyone." She opened the flap, thumbing through the pages without blinking. When she looked up, the contempt was gone. replaced by a flicker of something that looked dangerously like respect. I had learned the game. "Here are the terms," I said. "We split the pot. 1.5 million each. You take your half and vanish. I take mine and do the same. We never speak. We never look for each other. Mutually assured destruction. If you hunt me, I burn you. If I turn you in, you burn me." Vera sat silent for a long minute, the sounds of the bustling street fading into background noise. "What stops me?" she asked softly. "From killing you right now, taking the evidence and the money and disappearing before the server knows you're gone." I had anticipated the question. "Biometrics," I lied. It was a gamble, a bluff built on thin air. The check-in requires a retinal scan and a fingerprint. If I die, the clock runs out. If the system detects stress markers or coercion, it triggers the upload instantly. You can't force a dead man to blink. She held my gaze, searching for the tremor, the tell. But I was the man who had convinced 17 witnesses I was grieving a death that never happened. I knew how to perform. She stood up. She picked up the envelope. She didn't say yes. She didn't shake my hand. She just turned and walked away, dissolving into the crowd, a white linen ghost in the Singapore heat. I sat alone at the table, finishing my cold coffee, trying to decide if I had just saved my life or signed my death warrant. 7 days later, a notification pinged on my phone. $1.5 million had hit the numbered offshore account I hadn't told her about. The routing was so complex, it would take the NSA a year to untangle it. She had taken the deal, or she had paid me off to buy time. I didn't wait to find out. I took the money and ran. I changed cities. I bought a new name. I became a new person in a long line of strangers I used to be. Somewhere out there, Vera was doing the same, or maybe she was dead, or maybe she was plotting the long game, waiting for me to slip up. I would never know. That was the price of the ticket. Permanent, suffocating uncertainty. I still think about the Orpheum. I read online that they finally bulldozed it in August. It's just a dirt lot now, but the lesson it taught me is still standing. Watch the screen long enough, and you'll see exactly who you are. And the tragedy is, knowing yourself changes nothing. You still make the same mistakes. You still walk into the traps. You still become complicit in your own ruin. I helped Vera fake her death. I didn't mean to, but intent doesn't matter. I documented the fear. I sold the narrative. I identified a body I refused to look at closely. I performed grief so beautifully that the world applauded. I was the perfect mark because my vanity convinced me I was the hero of the story. Now I live in exile. I jump when a car backfires. I scan every face in the crowd, the woman at the cafe, the tourist on the bus, wondering if it's her, wondering if she's watching. The theater showed me 2 endings. Vera dies and I get rich, or I die and Vera gets rich. But the real ending, the one where we both live, both rich, both rotting in a prison of paranoia, that never appeared on the screen. It was too cruel even for the Orpheum. Sometimes in the dark, I wonder if Vera planned this part too. If she knew all along that the true punishment wasn't prison or death, but this endless, silent half-life. It feels, I have to admit, exactly like the ending I deserve.